on them saying how old they are. The scientists have to infer that from other evidence. But there's lots of evidence in the fossil record that fossils form rapidly. Here is some interesting evidence. An ichthyosaur fossilized in the act of giving birth. This creature was swimming along and didn't know it, but a wave was coming along in the ocean, choked with sediments, buried this creature alive, cut it off from scavengers, micro-decay organisms, and those sediments were quickly turned to stone. Or look at the fish caught in the act of eating its lunch. Fish decompose very rapidly, and yet we find many, many examples of fish not only preserved in the skeletal form, but even the soft parts, the fins, are preserved. This speaks of very rapid burial. Or consider jellyfish. I mean, they don't have any hard parts at all. And when jellyfish are in storms, they will often be washed up onto the shore. And when they're washed up onto the shore, they are in a fight for survival. And they start pumping on the sand to try to get ready for the next wave that will wash up so that they can go back into the ocean. A couple of years ago, geologists found a formation in Wisconsin that had thousands of jellyfish fossils in the layers, along with these ripple marks, both very transitory features. And they look just exactly like the impressions that are made by modern jellyfish pumping on a beach to survive. This speaks of rapid burial and rapid fossilization. We also see evidence of fossil graveyards. For example, the Karoo Formation in Africa, where 800 billion vertebrates estimated are buried together, all messed up. This is not where they lived. This is where they were buried. Or consider the formation in Florissant, Colorado. Shell creatures, some fish and birds, and hundreds of species of plants and insects are all buried together in one location. They didn't all live together when they were alive, but they're buried together. And then there's the formation in Agate Springs, Nebraska, which is what this picture is from. And here we find thousands of fossils of rhinoceros, camels, giant boars, and other exotic animals, none of which live in Nebraska today, and they're all mixed together. They're not buried where they lived, they're buried where they're buried. And they're not buried where they just fell over and expired and died. Some catastrophe mingled all these bones together. Well, how long does it take rocks to form and to erode? When I was working on my PhD in England, I came across an article in a newspaper in Norfolk, England, on the east side of England, and a very interesting article called Magic in the Marsh. And it talked about some geological research being done on the coast there, and it said, without any regard to the laws of geology, mud on the marsh is hardening into stone in a few years rather than the thousands it usually takes. Now there it is again. Now how do they know it usually takes thousands of years for rock to form? The answer is, they don't. It's an assumption. But now, reality is going to blow the assumption. It goes on to say, Professor Coleman, the lead geologist on this research, said the rock was forming faster than anybody had ever believed possible. You see what the problem was? It was beliefs. With one stone creating itself in just 6 months. They often contain beautifully preserved fossils where the detail of the soft flesh of the creature is caught, as well as the bone, as it had no time to rot before the rock formed around it. It doesn't take millions of years to form rock. All it takes is the right chemicals in the water. Now what's causing the rock formation here? Well, they studied this and they found that it was bacteria in the mud that were eating things in the mud and then excreting their waste product, which was producing the cementing agents that turn the mud into stone. Here's an interesting example of the power of preconceived ideas. The Scablands out in eastern Washington, covering an area of 15,000 square miles. Beautiful area of valleys and waterfalls. And for many, many decades, if you would check the literature, would have gone here and talked to a national park ranger, they would have said that this formation was formed over many, many millions of years by stream erosion. But if you go to a website today on the Scablands, you will be informed that this was all formed by floodwaters in 1 to 2 days. And here's where they think all the water came from. It was the dark region there is the Scablands area, and then up in Idaho and Montana, they believe there's strong evidence for what they believe was a glacial lake that was stopped up by a natural dam. That dam, perhaps ice, gave way, and this whole lake just flooded through there and carved that formation in 1 to 2 days. There's an interesting article on the history of the interpretation of the Scablands that was done by Dr. Stephen Jay Gould, a leading evolutionist at Harvard University who died a couple of years ago, one of the more honest evolutionists. And he talked about the debate about the formation of this area. There was a gentleman, a field geologist by the name of J. Harlan Bretz, who he was not in the hallowed halls of academia. He was a field geologist out there walking among the rocks, and he was convinced that this was formed catastrophically. And he wrote some journal articles in the 1920s and 30s, and most of the geological establishment just ignored what he had to say, first of all, because he didn't have any explanation for where the water came from. But another geologist eventually found the evidence for this Lake Missoula, as it's been called, and yet the scientific establishment still rejected his views. And here's what Stephen Jay Gould had to say about this. The establishment, as represented by the United States Geological Society, closed ranks in opposition. Instead of testing Brett's flood on its own merits, they rejected it on general principles. You see what's happening? They didn't go out and look at the rocks and see what Brett's was seeing. They just rejected his theory on general principles, uniformitarian assumptions. Gould goes on to say, Brett stood against a firm and highly restrictive, what's that word? Dogma. I thought dogma was only in religion and theology. No, dogma is in science. It's also called a paradigm. He says, he was standing against a restrictive dogma that never had made any sense. The emperor had been naked for a century. Charles Lyell, the godfather of geological gradualism or uniformitarianism, had pulled a fast one in establishing the doctrine of imperceptible change. Now we see examples of the incredible erosive power of water in many places today. Here's just an average flood in Canyon Lake Spillway in Texas in 2002. The water in this picture is moving at 107,000 cubic feet per second, which is 600 times faster than normal. Now, I wonder what kind of damage that would do. Well, we found out after the flood subsided. Here was some of the damage. Ripped right through that highway and cut down through solid rock. And here's a picture of some of the boulders that water was carrying. And there's a man in the background for scale. Look at the size of those rocks. Moving water can carry rocks the size of cars if it's moving fast enough. And what happens when the water is carrying rocks like that is that they act like jackhammers, hammering on the bed of whatever surface it's going over and just pulverizing and breaking up more. Incredible destruction of moving water. For many, many decades, the National Park Service at the Grand Canyon said the Colorado River cut the Grand Canyon. Just slowly, a little bit at a time. Just a grain of sand, a grain of limestone at a time, over millions and millions of years. But that idea is just ridiculous, really, when we look at the whole canyon. Here is the Colorado River Valley right here. I had the privilege of going on a raft trip down the Grand Canyon, and then we walked out on the way out, and I walked out on Bright Angel Trail. But look at this canyon, 4 to 18 miles wide. You can't say the Colorado River cut all that unless you redefine what you mean by Colorado River. You got to have water carving through all of that. It looks a lot more like a whole lot of water in a short period of time rather than a little bit of water over a long period of time. And that's what many, many geologists, including even evolutionary geologists who are acquainted firsthand with the Grand Canyon are saying. Here's an interesting statement. From 1924 to 1988, there was a visitor sign above the entrance to Carlsbad Caverns that said Carlsbad was at least 260 million years old. In 1988, the sign was changed to read 7 to 10 million years old. Then for a little while, the sign read that it was 2 million years old. Now the sign is gone. Now what's going on here? The caverns are not getting younger from 1924 to 1998. They're getting older by about 60 years. So what's happening? What's happening is that the cave is blowing the assumptions of the geologists out of the water. They're watching these stalactites and the stalagmites, and they're making other observations, and they're saying, we made some wrong assumptions about how long it takes these things to form. And now they're not sure. Well, what about radiometric dating methods? You know, carbon-14, rubidium, strontium, potassium, argon, uranium, lead. Most of the world has been led to believe that these are foolproof methods that prove millions of years, but they don't. The first thing we need to know about these dating methods is that in general, dates in the correct ballpark are assumed to be correct and are published, but those in disagreement with other data are seldom published, nor are the discrepancies fully explained. So now you know that when you read a newspaper article or a magazine article, like Time or Newsweek, and they talk about the fact that these fossils have been dated in rock layers that are X million years old, now you know that the published date was a selected date. It wasn't all the dates they got when they applied the dating methods to those rocks. Let me give you an example. Mount St. Helens was a beautiful mountain in 1980, in early 1980. There were boats sailing on there, but on May 18th, 1980, there was nobody sailing on that mountain because the geologists knew from observations over several years that this mountain was ready to blow its top. And it did at about 8:30 in the morning. About 1/3 of the volcano was removed by the explosion, and in the top of the crater in the volcano, a lava dome began to develop as lava continued to ooze into the crater. Here's a view of the mountain from the top, and there we see the crater in the middle. And Dr. Steve Austin from the Institute for Creation Research went up to the top of the mountain to collect samples of this lava to send it off to the laboratories to date with these radiometric dating methods. Now, he got his degree at Penn State University. He trained under some of the leading evolutionary geologists. They taught him how to take proper rock samples. They taught him how to prepare them, to send them to the laboratory for dating. So he did all that, and he asked them to give the dates for the rock. And they applied 4 different methods on these rocks, and the results came back that these rocks were 340,000 to 2.8 million years old. Now, what are these radiometric dates telling us? They're telling us the time that it was from the present back to the time that the rocks crystallized from the molten lava state to become solid rock. But we know when that happened because we know when the volcano erupted. And these rocks are actually less than 25 years old because the rocks formed after the volcano blew its top. Now, evolutionists will often say, well, we will admit that the radiometric dating methods are not absolutely correct. They're off by a little bit, but they're not off by millions of years. Oh, yes, they are. And this is not the only example. We find many examples published in the literature of rocks of known age where the lava came out in recent times. There were eyewitnesses to record when this happened, and when we apply the dating methods to those rocks, the methods don't work. They give clearly erroneous dates. And yet the evolutionists want to say that when they apply the dating methods to rocks of unknown age, in other words, rocks that formed when there were no human observers, so we don't know by eyewitness testimony when they were formed, they want us to assume that the dating methods work then. That is not a good thing to assume. Creation scientists have been working on this question for a number of years in a group called the RATE Group. And back in August of 2003 on our website, AnswersInGenesis.org, there was a layman's summary of some very recent exciting research. And if you just type the word rate, R-A-T-E, into the search engine and look for the article, which will probably be the first article that pops up, a rate group reveals exciting breakthroughs, you can read in layman's terms about that exciting research. And then in the first or second footnote, there are links to the Institute for Creation Research website where you can read the technical articles. So, we look at the rocks of the earth, and the evolutionists tell us that these rocks formed over millions and millions of years. The evolutionists say that mile-deep pile in the Grand Canyon was at least 300 million years, and then it was more millions of years to carve out the Grand Canyon. But it's not the witness to millions of years. It is actually the witness to Noah's flood. A catastrophe of unimaginable magnitude that destroyed the earth and laid down sediments, burying creatures alive in those sediments. But the evolutionists don't believe in a global flood on the earth, but they do believe in a global flood. A flood of biblical proportions, enough to fill the Mediterranean Sea. Well, we know that's not the biblical proportions, but it gushed down from the highlands of Mars 1 billion or so years ago. The latest pictures from the Pathfinder confirmed on Monday. The total release of gases from Tharsis magma may have produced the equivalent of a global layer of water nearly 400 feet deep. At the end of the Noachian epoch, they even call this after Noah's name. Volcanic activity dissipated. But they've got the flood on the wrong planet. Now this is really difficult for people to understand. How can brilliant scientists at NASA and other places believe in a flood on Mars where to date there is no evidence of even a single drop of liquid water? And yet they scoff at creationists for believing in a global flood on planet Earth that is 70% covered with liquid water. And then they say, well, where did all the water come from? And where did it all go to? Well, all you have to do is flatten out the land masses of the earth and raise the ocean basins, and there's enough water in our oceans to flood the earth to a depth of 3 kilometers. There's plenty of water on this planet. How can these brilliant scientists, who compared to me, compared to them, I'm a mental midget. How can they believe in a flood on Mars and not believe in a flood on the earth? It's not an issue of intelligence. I'll give you several explanations. Romans 1. For even though they knew God, they did not honor Him as God or give thanks, but they became futile in their speculations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools. Or John 3. Jesus said, this is the judgment, that the light has come into the world, and men love the darkness rather than the light, for their deeds were evil. For everyone who does evil hates the light and does not come to the light for fear that his deeds will be exposed. The Bible teaches that sin darkens the mind. Sin distorts our thinking. And the more that our mind is thinking about the really important questions of life, like, why am I here? Where did I come from? Is there a God? What happens to me after I die? The more my mind is thinking about those questions, the more sin will darken my understanding, unless I am willing to submit to the one who made me. 2 Peter says this, first of all, you must understand that in the last days, scoffers will come, scoffing and following their own evil desires. They will say, where is this coming he promised? Ever since our fathers died, everything goes on as it has since the beginning of creation. The Apostle Peter was an ignorant fisherman, never went to university, never studied geology. But the sentence in yellow, written almost 2,000 years ago, is a perfect layman's summary of the uniformitarian assumption of Charles Lyell. All things continue just as they have since the beginning of creation. And Peter goes on to say, when they say this, and when they deny the second coming, and they argue this way about the past, he says, they say this because they deliberately forget, or as the King James says, they are willfully ignorant of the fact that long ago by God's Word, 2 things. The heavens existed and the earth was formed out of water and by water. And by these waters, secondly, the world at that time was deluged and destroyed. So Peter says the reason people will think about reject the second coming and think in this uniformitarian way is because they